Hello, very welcome to this session, which is titled The Space as Representation inside the track Futures and Heritage. This session includes 4 very interesting papers that discuss the notion of spatial representation from different perspectives, from music to magic, passing through 3-dimensional representations. First, you have 2 authors, Ning Fong and Tobias Klein, presenting the paper Spatial Photograms, Experimental Cyanotype Photography using 3D scanning and printing technologies, which propose a novel photographic practice based on traditional pre-photographic image making and also today digital image methods. Then Ollie Bone, Kurt Mikolajisk, Sam Ferguson, and Benedict Curry will present the paper Buildings as Audio-Visual Synthesizers, Experiments Performing Live Music on Wirelessly Networked Multi-Speaker Media Architectures, which presents an approach to expanding live music performance practice to encompass sonic media architectures. The third paper, presented by Byeongwon is titled Namjoon Paik's Bibimbap Aesthetics as a Korean reinterpretation of the Gesamtkunstwerk, which describes a mixed media work based on Bibimbap aesthetics. And finally, Peter Anders presents the Tapestry, Past and Possibility in the History of Magic, which presents a mapping of the history of magic. Each paper will be presented in a very interesting video, so let's enjoy the presentations.
Hello everyone, this is the presentation of the full paper Spatial Photograms, Experimental Cyanotype Photography using 3D scanning and printing technologies by me, Fong, and Dr. Tobias Klein for ISEA2022. This research is an practice-based critical review of the photographic representation of space. It comprises 2 main parts. First, there is a cultural artistic contest of objective photos of space, and the second is an artistic practice as a response to the context, and therefore recreate spatial photograms. A practice involve traditional and emerging technology, as well as some technologies involved in digital fabrication, such as 3D scanning, 3D printing, and cyanotype. We critically use materials from different eras to suggest new possibility of photography, especially the photographic representation of space. Our research is started from a quote from a famous photo critic, Susan Sontag, and her word is, "Photos are a way of imprisoning reality. One can't possess reality, one can possess images. One can't possess the present, but one can possess the past." We are interested in the idea of the capability of photo in captivating space, in which the photo owner can possess part of the representations. We contextualize the photographic representation of space in the history of photography critically into the elements of a camera, the aperture, the lens, and the film. Then we will analyze the making of spatial photogram and the technologies behind. Functional aesthetic is a photo shooting strategy founded in reaction to soft focus pictorialism and the East Coast hegemony from Group F64 in Oakland, California. The group shot with a very small aperture to achieve ultimate sharpness in the photo. They tried to divorce the subjective thought of the photographer and the notion of space, and therefore they celebrate objectivism via their photos. As a sample by one of the photographers from group F64, Ansel Adams, we can see the photo is super sharp and all details are well articulated. However, photographers from group F64 manipulate the contrast of images to create spectacular photos, in fact, that also romanticize nature, which eventually goes against the true objectivism as what they said. We can see the photos is in a very high contrast, which is not similar to our ordinary visual experience. New Sächlichkeit or new objectivity is a movement that started in the 1920s. Is well known for rejecting expressionism and articulating a sentimental scientific representation of the world. There are two examples to illustrate this new objectivity and the photographic practice. One is by Karl Blossfeldt, and the other is by Bernd and Hila Becher. Both of them customized their cameras and lenses to create non-distorted photos to accentuate the notion of objectivism. Karl Blossfeldt objectively photo with no perspective and trying to depict all details through his photos. And for the photo on the right, we can see a collection, a typology of photos by Bernd Becher and Hila Becher, the pit heads. They tried to capture those structures, architectures objectively with no distortion and with an orthographic angle to achieve the true objectivism. However, lens distorts in nature. Every lens-based image are distorted because that is the science behind lens. Lens-based photograph is not the only way to make photos. We explore the photos by a British photographer and a botanist, Anna Atkins, who made a series of cyanotype of British algae. In her practice, she directly exposed the objects on the light-sensitive surface to capture and preserve the material density, translucency, and the silhouette of the photographed object. This approach allows the photographer to photographically capture the volume of the photographed objects. This cameraless photograph is a decentralized visualization, which is a counterpart of the lens-based photographic truth. In comparison to Karl Blossfeldt photos, the Anna Atkins photo represent material density and how the plants actually occupy the space. Since the F64 group and new Sächlichkeit cannot achieve the real spatial objectivity, we invent a new method that can realize true spatial objectivity in photography. Spatial photogram is a method to make photograms out of objectified space to achieve photographic objectivity of space without a lens distortion. And here below is the technical setup of making spatial photogram. First, we will 3D scan and subdivide the space in a 3D software, and then we will print and materialize the 3D model. After that, we will calibrate the material-based image. Then we have done some tests, and lastly, we will present our final work, spatial photogram. In our practice, we use photogrammetric scan to preserve more details on the edge of the scanned environment, comparing to lighter point cloud scan. As the image on the right upper corner, which is a rendering of the subtracted model in a diagonal orthographic view. Then we are retrieving the invisible space through Boolean calculation. The way to make this Boolean calculation cut is to slide the model into 12 blocks to preserve more details. And this technique is inspired by the trapezoidal rules for estimation in calculus. Since the edge of the scan is not all on the same height, some details of the scan is located to the upper part of the scan. We have to do the Boolean calculation on different levels to preserve details. The printing technique is fuse the deposition model FDM with polylactide PLA, which is structurally consistent under UV light. We have tried different material and printing techniques. For example, the light-sensitive stereographic print SLA that uses UV light to harden the printed model. Comparing to this technique, FDM is more structurally stable in terms of long UV light exposure, and comparing to other light-insensitive 3D printing technologies, for example, selective laser synthesis, SLS, FDM has a smoother finishing, and the surface is too porous for printing. And for the photographic printing technique, we use Cyanotype, which is a silver-free photographic printing process. This printing process is environmental friendly. For the UV light, we use UVC, which is effective to activate cyanotype sensitizer. And the exposure time of the printing process is 20 minutes, which is the minimum time for activating the emulsion. The thickness to color density is a relationship, help us indicate the thickness through the color intensity. Not only can we predict the color of the print through the thickness of the 3D model, we can also do that reversely. Based on the color intensity of the print, we can also estimate the thickness of the model. The LAB to LAB lookup table is a table that's the same as the lookup table we use for post-production and color grading. It is used to resemble the color with a particular standard, and that is an algorithm that can retain the tone and contrast. Here is the test we made. The image on the left is the original photo, and the image in the middle is a 3D printed model based on the photograph on its left. And the image on the right is the cyanotype print, a photogram based on the 3D printed model in the middle. This is an example of printing a cyanotype with a 3D printed stencil. We started from a photo, then we modified the photo through the lookup table, and we displaced the 3D model through a height map displacement in the 3D software. And then we printed out the 3D model. And lastly, we print a cyanotype through this model, a stencil we call. This material-based photograph is in fact a photogram instead of a negative-based photo that we usually make in the darkroom. In our photogram, we use thickness to diffuse and reflect the light to create contrast on our final print. This is also a test to test out the accuracy of the lookup tables. The cyanotype print is blurry and out of focus because of its thickness. And in fact, that is also the language of photogram about the material density and the height. The spatial photogram involves three phases. First, 3D scanning of a space. Second, 3D printing of the manipulated scan. And lastly, cyanotype printing. We scale the model proportionally to 5 millimeters because that is the most efficient thickness for printing cyanotype based on our research. We expose the sensitized print with the model under a UV light source with a 360 wavelength for 20 minutes. We expose the same model and photograph them from top and from the bottom. The image on the top is a photo from a flatbed scanner, and the photo in the bottom is the spatial photogram that we made photogram out of this 3D printed model. The print is a reciprocal image that is not totally mirrored. The two photos are pseudo-symmetric. However, having the same material density, we can achieve two different appeals because of the height offset and the out of focus. And that is also beyond the material density. And it is about how this space is more than a flattened 2D floor plan. And it involves blurriness, and that blurriness narrates the spatial quality of that space. And the spatial photogram is a truly objective photo of space that involves no lens distortion and emphasize space that is sensible but invisible. And that is the end. Thank you.
I am very honored to present my recent project, at ISEA 2022. I am Byeongwon Ha, an artist and an art historian in the field of new media art. The title of my research is Namjoon Paik's Bibimbap Aesthetics as a Korean reinterpretation of the Gesamtkunstwerk. I know that you are confused about these unfamiliar terms, Bibimbap and the Gesamtkunstwerk. In 1967, Korean-born and New York-based artist Namjoon Paik published the essay Electronics, Arts, and Bibimbap for Korean readers. In his writing, Bibimbap Aesthetics was a creative tool for approaching the emerging phenomenon of mixed media in contemporary art. Bibimbap is a Korean traditional food which combines rice and an egg, meat, and a variety of vegetables. The term bibimbap is a compound word. Bibim, mixing, plus bap, rice. It literally means mixed rice with something. Bibimbap does not include objects, and it is often worked with variations based on locations and seasonal products. On the right side, you can see the Google images of the Gesamtkunstwerk. The German term mainly indicates architecture, which incorporates time and space at the same time. I will continue to talk about the topic later. First of all, I would like to talk about a relationship between Paik and Serialism, or 12-tone music. When Paik studied 12-tone music in West Germany, he was also an aspiring composer based on 12-tone technique, which was the purest style of music. It focuses on tonality, which is the most fundamental element in Western music. As you can see in the composition of Arnold Schoenberg, the 12-tone music utilizes each tone equally, without duplicates. It refers to the autonomy of music. At the same time, Paik published several articles about purist, even mathematical 12-tone music for Korean and Japanese readers. While pursuing 12-tone music, Paik met John Cage at the Darmstadt summer courses in West Germany in 1958. Paik attended Cage's theatrical music performances and lectures. This encounter thoroughly changed Paik's idea on music. After meeting Cage, unlike Paik's previous interest in purism in 12-tone music, he started to create a form of art with mixed media. In Paik's letter to Cage, you can find Paik's new idea about music with heterogenic materials. In the end of the letter, Paik mentioned Richard Wagner's whole art. What is Wagner's whole art? Richard Wagner's article, The Artwork of the Future, explains the philosophy of the term. To achieve the highest artwork, the separate artist from different media must quell each selfish harmful outgrowth of the whole, from the whole. Richard Wagner's whole art is the Gesamtkunstwerk, total work of art. Now it's clearer to see these images with the term Gesamtkunstwerk. The Gesamtkunstwerk pursues a significant harmony with different forms of art, like a mixture among painting, furniture, stage, sculpture, light, and installation in architecture. I would like to examine two methods to understand the Gesamtkunstwerk in art. The aesthetic level of the Gesamtkunstwerk is the blending of diverse arts and genres in multimedia, operatic, and synesthetic creations. The political level of the Gesamtkunstwerk is the interactive transgression of the concrete boundary between art and life. These two ideas of the Gesamtkunstwerk explain Namjoon Paik's Bibimbap aesthetics in his article. Based on the Bibimbap aesthetics, Paik mentions three different mixed media. First, Nobert Wiener's Cybernetics. Next, Alan Kaprow's Happening. Finally, John Cage's music. In a mixed communication between a human and a machine, Paik emphasized that cybernetics allowed a machine to understand humans' communication, not vice versa. Paik's idea on cybernetics not only indicates his philosophy on interactive art, human-centered perspective to cybernetics in his first solo exhibition, Exposition of Music, Electronic Television, in 1963, but also suggests the creative video manipulation system or his video synthesizer, which allows the artist to interact with electronic interface to make electronic art. Since Paik interacted with audiences in a violent way, he was named a cultural terrorist by Alan Kaprow. In his action music, Paik decided to break the boundary not only between several media, but also between performers and audiences. He often trespassed a clear boundary between the audience and performers on the stage by cutting the necktie of John Cage, who sits as an audience member in Etude for Pianoforte, and by encouraging the audience to disturb an opera during the performance in Entwicklungshilfe. And this is a kind of a more experimental version of Alan Kaprow's happenings. Cage's music shows a blurred boundary between music and noise in his theatrical music. Cage equally focused on any sounds from any materials. There were no preferences in between music and noise. For example, in Water Walk in 1959, Cage used everyday materials such as a bathtub, a pot and toy, as well as the piano. Specifically, he did not play the piano, but hit the body of the piano, or directly touch the strings in the piano. In a similar way, Paik realized his Gesamtkunstwerk project, Etude for Pianoforte, in 1960. Here, you can find a motorcycle that Paik mentioned in his Gesamtkunstwerk idea. Furthermore, John Cage utilized several electronic devices, all in Variations 7th, in 1966. In real time, Cage made sounds with telephone lines, radio receivers, and square generators. In this regard, Cage did not distinguish noise with music in Variations 7th. In the end, by blurring boundaries between art and technology, his music contributed to redefine an idea on music. This performance was part of the historical theater event 9 Evenings, Theater and Engineering, organized by Experiments in Art and Technology, or EAT. The Cage's performance returns to cybernetics and happenings ideas. In the same context, Paik's whole art in his letter to Cage shows art and technology with everyday materials. In this regard, those creators' mixing approaches are intertwined with Paik's Bibimbap aesthetics. Paik's collage philosophy not only mixed diverse media, but also trespassed a boundary between art and life, as well as between art and technology. This coincides with the different levels of the Gesamtkunstwerk that I mentioned. After pursuing the opposite side of mixed media in music, or 12-tone music, Paik focused on the Gesamtkunstwerk to develop a variety of his own mixed media. In electronics, arts, and bibimbap, he did not have to mention the German term Gesamtkunstwerk anymore, since the Korean-born artist inherently had a unique generic approach, or Bibimbap aesthetics. This is the reference information. Thank you for watching my virtual presentation.
Hi, I'm Peter Anders. I'm based in the United States, and I'm a former board member and chair of ISEA, and I want to welcome all of you to ISEA2022 in Barcelona. I'd like to introduce you to a project I've been working on for the past few years. It's called the Tapestry. The Tapestry is a mapping project of the history of magic. Well, what do we mean by magic? Magic can cover a whole range of different issues. It's not just the fellow that comes to your kid's birthday party and performs a couple tricks. Magic in this case refers to conjuring, divination, telepathy, mesmerism, telekinesis, talismans, Enochian magic, and so forth. Well, what is magic? Let's look at some definitions. Arthur Clarke wrote that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Eugene Berger, the magician, says that beyond the enchantments of illusion, magic points to the mystery. Dean Radin, an author, writes that magic is to religion as technology is to science. So you can see kind of a reference back to Arthur Clarke's quote on technology and magic. Since about the 1980s, there's been a new field of academic research into the Western esoteric tradition. This comprises various traditions outside of Judeo-Christian belief and rationalist science that persist in Western culture. The subject matter is broad, and there are many books being written on the subject by authors such as Goodrick Clark, Verselius, Ruiz, Favre, and the others. Now, given esotericism's mystical and suggestive nature, it's hard to get a clear picture of its development and the individuals and agencies involved. The tapestry presents esotericism's history as a map showing the evolution of its characteristic trait, magic. First things first, we have to talk a little bit about what a lifeline is. In making maps, one has to have location, dates, so forth, to actually map out one of these lines. Let's say that I was born in northwest Spain, and that, and so you can see number 2 in there is the second place. Maybe that's where I went to school. I studied and did some work in point number 3. I gave a presentation in Barcelona at number 4. In Madrid, I got, say, involved in some nefarious activities. And number 6 would be some other event, and number 7 is where I'm, the map ends. It might be where I died, for that matter. So these lifelines or threads are connecting different events in someone's life. And if one mapped out several people's lives this way, you'd have intersections and interactions being indicated by these lines. Now, weaving these threads together could suggest a flow of influence and practice over the many centuries, and the tapestry is this map of different people influencing each other, different activities over time, and how that flows through the different time periods. The tapestry consists of a database and a Google map. The data resources are drawn from Wikipedia, web searches, and literature on the subject. The Tapestry Database lists all the different events in a life in separate entries, and each entry has 22 attributes. Presently, there are 18,000 entries for over 3,000 individuals, societies, and organizations. The Tapestry Database looks like this. It's a very simple Excel spreadsheet, and you can see the different components of that. If we take a look from the left to the right, you have first and last names of the person being studied, the date of birth, date of death, dates of activities, the location of those activities, the country and the city, locations on the map, and citations, which refer to where that information is drawn from for that particular event, and the different roles that this person would play, such as astrologer, Kabbalist, esoteric philosophy, perhaps a book. And then finally, the last 2 major ones are the influence on that person and who that person influenced, and then there are notes. The Tapestry project ranges from 4000 BC to the present. Each individual century or era can be accessed separately. The map shows the Earth overlain with a network of colored lifelines, and we'll see that in a moment. The colors of the lifelines show the category of magic, the belief, the practice. Straight line segments link event locations and times. And note, there are no wiggly lines, there are no curved lines in these maps, because in order to make them curved, you'd require extra data, which we don't have at the present time. And event icons can be queried for additional information or links, and I'll demonstrate that in a moment. This is what the tapestry looks like for the 1600s. And on the left, you can see a list of names of people that lived at that time. And on the right, you see the map overall. And that shows what was going on and where and how. And I'll give a little demonstration of how the tapestry actually works in practice. This is the Google Earth interface for the Tapestry project. On the right, we see the Earth, which can be viewed at any angle or at any magnification. And on the left is a listing of eras and centuries that range from 4000 BCE to the present day. Each of these centuries can be opened up, and beneath that we see categories of different types of magical practice. That includes the lifelines of alchemists, astrologers, Kabbalists, witches, and the like. Below that is a legacy of people, traditions, and events that survived into the 1500s, from the 1400s and beyond. We have people, traditions from previous eras, and a war that happened in northern Poland. Below that, we have a listing of over 200 people, societies, and other entities that had anything to do with magic during that period. And each of these individual folders can be queried, and we can take a look at events that made up that person's life. In this case, we have John Dee. John Dee was an important Elizabethan figure. He worked with Queen Elizabeth I as her wizard and advisor. He was an alchemist. He was an astrologer. He was an occultist. He had all the makings of being a great magician, and for that reason is an important figure in the history of magic. If you take a look at John Dee's first event, which would be his birth, we can open that up and take a look at all of the activities he was involved in his lifetime, the years of his birth and his death, and what he was known for, as well as a link to the Wikipedia page that provides a source material for this lifeline. Dee spent the bulk of his life in England, but he had an important foray into what is now known as Czechia, or Hungary. It was called at that time Bohemia. And during that time, he worked with a scryer, a fellow named Edward Kelly, who was born later than him. He was born in 1555. And you can see Kelly's lifeline in purple here, that it does follow roughly the trajectory of Dee and certainly overlaps during their period in Prague and the surrounding areas. Now, Dee and Kelly spent years trying to communicate with angels and in the development of what is called Enochian magic, which is still practiced. But they had a falling out. The working conditions were difficult for Kelly, and Kelly was argumentative, and he had convinced Dee that their contact angel insisted that they swap wives, which came as a surprise to everyone, particularly the wives. Kelly and Dee did so, but their working relationship suffered, as one might imagine. And Kelly stayed working as an alchemist for Rudolph II, whose lifeline I'm showing here in red. He was also an occultist. And Dee returned back to England from Europe using roughly this route here. Now, during that return, Dee encountered an alchemist named Heinrich Kunrath. Kunrath's lifeline is shown in white here, and the two of them met in Bremen, Germany. And you can see in this note here, I noted that he met with him. And Kunrath was looking for work as an alchemist, and Dee, rather generously I would say, suggested that Kunrath look up Edward Kelly and try to find work in the alchemical laboratories of Rudolph II, which Kunrath actually did. He moved down to Prague And although I don't have any documentation that they actually knew each other, but they were certainly in the same laboratories at around the same time. And Kelly later on passed away. He died falling from a window of a tower trying to escape his employer. And Coenrath had by then already gone on to look for other kinds of work. Being an alchemist at that time was fraught with trouble. You could lose your shirt, you could lose your life, and Kelly certainly stands as an example of how not to practice alchemy. Now Dee returned to London, broke, destitute, and although he tried to renew his contacts with Elizabeth I, she was not able to provide him with the funds that he needed. And it's possible that he may have encountered Walter Raleigh, the famous explorer and courtier of Queen Elizabeth I, when Raleigh returned in disgrace from his travels and was locked up in the Tower of London. The reason for the conjecture that the two of them may have met in this later period of Dee's life is that Raleigh took up alchemy while he was in the Tower of London, and Dee would have been certainly available to help out with that. Now, this little history that I've described is the result of 5 intersecting lifelines that happened in the 1500s. The 1500s in the Tapestry project contains over 200 lives and entities. And you can see with this matrix for that century, there are many intersections and trajectories and personalities that could lead to similar insightful stories telling us of the lives of the magicians of that period. On the screen right now is a time lapse of about 6,000 years of magical history. On the left side, you can see the centuries as they're being counted off. And on the main screen, you can see different colored lifelines flickering in and out of view. White lines represent traditions and practices. Yellow lines indicate alchemy or alchemists. Orange lines represent science or philosophy. Blue lines represent Kabbalists and other forms of sorcery. And you see the activity of Europe gets increasingly dense over the last 500 years or so. And in particularly in the 1800s, there's an intense activity going on in Europe, according to the sources I've been using. Here you see a nighttime map of the same tapestry for the 19th century. And it's a nighttime map, and you can see the lights flickering of different cities, and they're mixed in, which gives a kind of a magical effect. But the tapestry, in this case, wraps all the way around the world. Goes and addresses actually activity in the United States that was happening concurrently with what was going on in Europe. But Europe remains central to most of Western traditional activity in magic. Here you have a map showing the connection between Europe and Southeast Asia and Australia. Curiously, cities formed the primary hubs for magical activity. This would be probably because there were libraries and societies and government sponsorship of magical activity, say for things like astrology or alchemy. London in particular was seething with activity during the 1900s, as was Paris, Rome, Berlin, Prague, and other cities as well. From the descriptions I've given you of the tapestry, there is an obvious limitation. I've mapped out individuals, locations, time points, but if we're to rely on that as a model, the assumption would be that all human interaction is done personally and physically in the same place at the same time. But that's not really the case. We have books, we have other kinds of media that allow people to interact without actually being in the same place. And also, proximity doesn't necessarily prove interaction. Just because I live in an apartment building doesn't mean that I actually know all the people that live in that building with me. This lack of intersection doesn't necessarily mean there's a lack of influence. I could read a book by somebody else in the building and not even know that the person lived there. So there's some kind of subtleties that the Tapestry project can only suggest at, but doesn't actually map out. But the virtue of the tapestry is that it does show history at a great range of scales. We can look at it from a global point of view or an urban point of view, or actually down to the very buildings where things happened. It shows patterns of emergent from historic beliefs and practices. And history in this case is defined by the interaction and influence rather than driven by an overarching narrative. The tapestry is completed up to the 20th century. New additions and revisions are added as necessary. And as more information is obtained, the more accurate the map becomes. It's open-ended. I'm working on it still. I have no idea when it will end. Maybe it will never end at all. But I do want to thank you for your time and hope that you enjoy the rest of the ISEA Symposium. Thank you very much.